Now we are going to take a deep dive into the animation principles of drag, follow through, and overlap. These principles will allow you to create physically believable action sequences where characters are jumping, holding onto something, trying to catch themselves, pushing each other around. But you also need them to create cool little details like a cloth, a cape, a scarf following behind the character. If a bunny has floppy ears, you also need to have them flop around in a way that looks physically believable. I'm Ferdinand Englander for Animator Island, bringing you tips, tricks, and tutorials to help you become a better animator. In a previous video of this animation class, we talked about physics. You can watch that by clicking the link up there or in the video description. And one of the things that is very important for getting physics right is that elements are resistant to start, stop, or change direction. This resistance is called inertia, and it is behind all the things that we're talking about in this video. Here we have an apple in a pot, and if I move the pot really quickly, the apple at first is staying in place. This is similar to when you're standing in a subway train or a bus and the bus starts driving, but you are not accelerating yet. So you hold onto elements of the vehicle so you experience the same acceleration. And this happens to the apple when it hits the side of the pot, because then it definitely gets accelerated to the speed that the pot has. Something else interesting is happening when the pot slows down. The moment it goes slower, the apple shoots further because it still has the same momentum. It was charged with momentum when it was pushed by the side of the pot. And now that the pot is getting slower, the apple still has that same momentum, so it goes further to the right until it once again bumps into the side of the pot and has to get rid of that energy by bouncing in the opposite direction. For animation, it can be useful to keep 3 phases in mind. First, we have drag. This happens as soon as a leading element starts moving. Loose attached parts are just being dragged behind. As you might remember, the whole thing with resistance is that things would like to stay in place. And things that are being dragged behind, well, they are pointing towards the direction that they came from. As you can see here, when I'm pulling this string, the sections of the string that are further back only start moving when they absolutely have to, when they are being dragged by the portion that is directly in front of them. Now we get to the second phase, follow through. This happens when the leading element stops moving or changes direction. As we saw with the apple, the attached loose element is now charged with momentum that was put into it by tugging on it, by pulling on it. And this momentum is still there. So while the leading element is getting slower or even stopped, there's still the same momentum in the part that is being dragged behind. It now has to follow through with that momentum. It has to flip over until it can no longer go in that direction and swing back again, and then maybe eventually get into a stopping position. So let's assume our leading element is coming to a stop, then our attached element is coming to a stop a little bit later because it has to lose the momentum first. This is called overlap, when you have different elements of your character coming to a stop at different times. And as you can see, this is based in physics, inertia, and momentum. So if you have your character moving, it's unrealistic that all the body parts come to a stop at the same time. It's usually, if your character takes a step and now stands still, then the foot reaches that position first, then the leg, then the hips, then the upper body, and maybe you also have a little bit of a dip in the head. And this is all drag, overlap, follow through in action. I will show you two methods to create very smooth and believable looking drag, follow through, and overlapping actions. One method I will show you in this video, and the other one I'll tell you all about in the video next week. But first, if you like this tutorial so far, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss animation tutorials like this one. So here I have an animation already prepared. It's just a ball speeding up with an ease out and then easing into a position at the right. If you're animating something that is just being dragged behind, like a piece of cloth, a scarf, a skirt, stuff like this is just an additional detail, an additional layer on top of your main animation. So I would really recommend doing the main animation first, like we have done here. I have that completed motion of the ball, and then you can add the elements that are doing the overlap and the follow through as an extra layer on top of it. The other thing that I can recommend to you, don't draw the complete scarf at once, don't draw the skirt with all the wrinkles and that. Instead, you should simplify it and maybe just have a rough scribbled animation first. Let's say we want to give this ball a little cape behind it. So instead of drawing like a cape like this with wrinkles and, you know, maybe it has a fold here or something like that. Instead of doing that, I will make a scribble layer that simplifies it. So I'll just put two segments here. And just animating this as two segments, as two elements in a chain is a lot easier than trying to grasp the full curvy, flowy shape at once. The first animation method that I want to show to you is a post-to-post approach, where we tie down the most important phases of the animation first, and then later add the in-betweens that will make it really smooth. But what are these important poses that we need to hit to create a believable drag and follow through animation? I think we can identify the important poses by this guideline. Whenever there's something new happening, whenever there's a change, that is a new keyframe, a new drawing that we need to have in our rough post-to-post animation. The first keyframe is, of course, the starting position that we already drew. And then we can go in a couple frames, and the new action that is happening here is that the first element, the first section of our cape, is being dragged behind. Notice how it is pointing in the direction that it came from, and the second element in the chain is doing the same, but it's still pointing down. So this is the moment where the first element is already being dragged behind to the right, but the second element is just being pulled up because it has to stay connected here, but it didn't experience any drag to the right yet. Let's collect the important keyframes down here so we can see them in a row. The next new big thing that is happening is that the second element is also going to be tilting to the right. So let's go another 2 frames in, and here we have this frame where both sections are pointing backwards. So let's record that down here. Then we should go into the moment where the leading element is the fastest. And you can see that in the spacing that the ball reached a point where it has the 2 largest spacings here. So at this point, the ball was going at its fastest speed, and this would also lift the dragged behind elements up as far as they will go. We can have it be like this, maybe even a bit more than it was in the previous drawing. If this was underwater or in zero gravity, the drag behind element tends to be exactly on the motion path, which for this animation would be completely straight because the motion path is going straight from left to right. This is what would happen in outer space or underwater fairly quickly. But because on land we have gravity and this cape also has some weight to it, it will probably be dipped down a little towards the ground. Of course, if you are swinging a flag really fast, it will also follow along the motion path completely. Now, the next interesting thing that is happening in our animation is that the ball is slowing down. Right before we had these big spacings, which indicate a fast speed, and then we have smaller and smaller spacings, which indicate less and less speed. And as you know from the example with the apple, the main element, the pot, might be slowing down, but the following element, the apple, is not. It's now catching up with the leading element because it is still going at the same speed, or approximately the same speed that it had during the fastest part of the motion. One way to think about it is that here the ball had this big spacing, it now has this small spacing, but the element following behind still wants to do that bigger spacing, maybe already lost a little bit because, there is some resistance here, but that's why the following element is now overshooting in that direction. So in reality, this would happen now that the first following element is flipping over. But because we are in animation, we can exaggerate things a little bit. We could, for example, hold the flip over for like one more drawing, or just make this go down a little bit. This dip down happens because this ball is going slower, but the second element following, it's still just pointing into the direction that it is coming from. Also starting to dip down because it has to stay connected at that joint. And now here's the frame where we really see it clearly, where the first element has to dip down by a lot. The second element is just following the first one, trying to stay connected at the connection down there. Notice how we're starting to get this nice arc here. That's very important for a good looking follow through animation. So let's put that moment in our collection. We have this moment where the first element is tilting down and the second one is just following behind. For the segment settling after the main element came to a stop, we can look at another very important beginner exercise in animation as guidance, and that is the pendulum, the swinging pendulum. If you think about it, this is exactly what is happening here. We have something being dragged behind, and then when it comes to a stop, it just swings over back and forth until it is still. And a good pendulum animation, of course, looks like this. We have the starting keyframe and the end keyframe. In the middle, we have the breakdown. This frame is what makes us see clearly that this pendulum is moving along an arc. And then to complete that animation, we can have some ease frames. Here, the pendulum is picking up speed gradually by easing out of the first position to the left. And on the other side, the pendulum is easing into the position at the right. So this is something that is also happening to our cape, dangling from the main element. So now let's add what we just learned about the pendulum in our animation, with the added difficulty that we have two pendulums stuck together. So the first thing we have here is the first element swinging all the way to the right. This, of course, is the rightmost position of our pendulum. Now here I'm always keeping a couple of frames open to do some in-betweens later. Let's just go to our next most important drawing. And that, of course, is the breakdown of our first pendulum element. Then a couple frames later, we have the leftmost position of the pendulum. We're already making the swings not as wide because with every swing, we're losing momentum. Let's make this a little smaller so we have a more clearly defined arc. Then we have our next breakdown. And finally, this is coming to a stop. Now, just this so far is not looking that bad. It is a bit choppy because we haven't drawn all the in-betweens yet, but you can already see how it will come together. The second pendulum is offset from the first one. As the first element is going through the breakdown, we have the key of the second element And when the first section is in a key pose, the second section is just going through the breakdown. So here we have a breakdown. This, of course, is still heavily influenced by being dragged so much by this element down here. But this kind of is the extreme pose for this section. Now we have an extreme here, which means that the other pendulum is just going through a breakdown on the way already over to here, because as this first element is reaching its extreme position, it already slowed down, which causes this second element to start passing it in that direction. Because it's being dragged so heavily, there's a drag in that direction, and that whole pendulum system, what we have, you know, with the swing left to right and the breakdown, this whole thing is rotated over, because this whole system is being dragged behind. So the breakdown is here. And now for the next frame, just remember our chart. The first section is going through the breakdown phase, which means that the second section must be doing the extreme key to the right. Now, the difficult thing is that this whole system can influence other segments. Let's say if this end is extremely heavy, it will also cause this whole thing to lag behind, because this weight is pulling it to the right a little bit more than it would be if there would just be one pendulum. But for now, let's see if we can simplify it a bit. This should still be kind of believable. Now the first section is reaching an extreme key, which means that the second section is already on its way over in a breakdown, slightly tilted to the right, on its way over to the left. Now the first section is doing another breakdown. The second section is flipping over. The first section reached its extreme point, which means that the second section is in its breakdown on the way over. And then last but not least, we have the moment where the first section was already still and the second section is now reaching its extreme key one moment later. And this is how that looks. Let's look at our chart again, and what we can now see very clearly is how this is always a chain reaction. Look at how it starts. The first element starts moving to the right, and 4 to 8 frames later, the second element does the same thing. Then the leading element comes to a stop, which causes the first element to flip over. The second element is not doing that yet, but it's doing that next 4 to 8 frames later. Now the first element is swinging back. The second element is not swinging back yet, but 4 to 8 frames later, it is swinging back. This could repeat a couple of times, because from here on, the first element can swing to the right again, and this is basically the same constellation as here. The whole thing starts over. The first element swung to the right, so a little later, the second element also swings to the right. Do you see how this is a chain that repeats again and again? In our example animation, we come to a stop relatively quickly, but in reality, things can swing back and forth a lot of times before they come to a stop. But it's just repeating what we just wrote down, just with amplitudes that are getting smaller and smaller. You might notice that our animation is looking kind of tame. It's not like super exaggerated cartoony animation. And that is because we went so close to how reality is. Of course, in animation, you can always bend reality and put a little bit extra on top of it. You could hold the extremes longer, the moment where it flopped over completely to the other side. We could have delayed the entire tape going to the right even longer. Those are some things that you can play with. And if you just have a couple of frames like these, it's very easy to retime them and add some more frames here and there. And we also have another opportunity to add some extra punch during the in-betweening, because depending on how we do the in-betweens, we can stress some extremes a little more. Let me show you what I mean. But first, I want to tell you that we have some premium tutorials that you can purchase if you want to learn even more, do more exercises to become a better animator even faster. And it will, of course, really support this channel and help me to make more tutorials. Another great way to support us is on Patreon. And we also have a group mentoring tier over there. So if you want feedback for your illustration, animation, story, idea, whatever you're currently working on, you can join the group mentoring tier and hop on a group mentoring call every month. There you will get feedback from the other members and from a professional mentor like me. I'll draw over your work, give you annotations and advice on how to improve it. So if that sounds interesting to you, if you want to have like a more of a classroom mentoring experience, then the group mentoring tier on Patreon might be the thing for you. So as you can see in the timeline, I always left some space here between the frames. Oh, this could be one more. And this is like the minimum amount of frames on twos that I would leave to put in some in-betweens here. On twos just means that I'm holding one frame for 2 frames, so I don't have to draw a bazillion frames on 24 frames per second. So let's see what an in-between could mean for our animation. Here we have a moment where the first element is on the breakdown and the second element is on the extreme plus being dragged behind a lot. So how does the moment look between here? Now, if you remember our swinging pendulum animation from earlier, we always want to ease out and ease into the extreme positions. And this will also add some emphasis to these extreme keyframes that can help to make our animation a lot more readable and a bit more cartoony. So what I would do here is, this is the extreme that we need to hit. So we know that the first pendulum is easing into here. This is a little difficult because the main element is also still moving. If we would layer this on top of it, see this? This is just an ease into that extreme position, but we put it a little more over here. This, of course, also adds some drag. I think we could make it a little further to the left. But to emphasize things, let's have it a bit like this. Now, the thing that you need to be careful with now is to keep in mind that for the first element, we are favoring with our ease frame the extreme to the right. But for the second element, we are favoring, because this was just the extreme of the second element, we are favoring the extreme to the left. So what you shouldn't do under no circumstances is to draw a frame that is just kind of like in the middle of everything. That will just look dull. We could draw a frame where the whole pendulum is still very far up, very far to the left. So again, if we see that in relation, this is not even close to being an ease. Let's draw that one over here. So, you know, this would be an ease for this pendulum system that is happening over here. And now we attach that here. Maybe we should mellow it a little bit. Maybe like this. So let's do this one more time. Now the first element is swinging over to the left, which means we need to favor the extreme position that we just had. So we draw a frame where it's closer to the red onion skin, like this, because we are favoring this extreme. For the second element, we are favoring the extreme to the right, which is the one that we'll have in the next frame, this one. So again, we could draw relative, pretend that our pendulum is connected here, and we can build our ease frame into the rightmost extreme, and then just attach that whole thing to the first element. And you know what? We could exaggerate it even more. This is a thing that you could also try. You could try to have the extreme now while the first element is doing the ease. This is also something that can look really good and stresses the left and right motions even more. Now, let's do it one more time. The first element is easing into the extreme position to the left. The second element is just coming from the position to the right. So this would be like that. Let's move it over. If you want to emphasize the drag even more, you could even pull it up, which technically would make this one the extreme now. And this is how we continue. Ease out of the first, ease into the extreme. And on the last frame, all we have to do is ease into the last extreme of the second element. And this is how it looks. We have some in-betweens to fill here at the beginning, so let's do that real quick. But this is more of a painting by number game because, you know, we already know where this is moving towards. And there we have our completed post-to-post animation with all in-betweens. Now, I understand that this constantly jumping back and forth between frames and, you know, keeping things in mind, maybe even writing things down, like what is a breakdown, what is an ease, feels a bit unintuitive and removed from the spontaneous motion because it is mostly planning. It gives you a decent result, but you don't really feel the motion as you're animating because you're constantly jumping back and forth and thinking, oh, if this is an ease, this is a breakdown, I need to push the ease a little bit more. It's a very cognitive approach. So this is why I want to show you another method where we animate straight ahead and feel out the drag and the follow through action frame by frame. For a lot of people, this feels a lot more intuitive and easier. So if you want to learn this, stick around, check out the video next week. Don't forget, we have premium tutorials if you want to learn even more right now and practice more and become an even better animator. And I have to thank my patrons for supporting me on Patreon. You can join them and help me make more videos like this. And there's also the group mentoring that I mentioned earlier, where you can get feedback for your animation every month. In any case, thank you so very much for watching, and I hope you'll be back for the tutorial about the other follow through and drag animation method. Have a great day and keep on animating.